Hello everybody and welcome to this week's episode of the TF1 Show. My name is Tinus Ferreira, your host, best friend and soft sponge that wipes even the oiliest grime from the designer cutlery that is the world of F1. And this week, dear friends, we'll be discussing a topic very close to my heart, the Formula One silly season. Nowhere else will you experience the same amounts of deception, lies, gossip and heartbreak as in Formula One when all the members of the press, fans and podcasters like myself try to figure out what the grid is going to look like next season. Maybe first I must accommodate the layman out there and quickly explain what silly season in Formula One is. So as I mentioned in the intro, we are all speculating what next year's grid is going to look like in terms of which driver will end up at which team basically. Who will be whose teammate? Will we see the dramatic return of Nico Rosberg out of retirement with a drive at Ferrari? Will Verstappen and Pierre Gasly turn out as secret lovers, which would explain why Red Bull hasn't fired Gasly yet? Any ludicrous theory could be true in F1 silly season, and the press as well as the fans eat it all up. And best of all, every now and then, one of these ridiculous rumors become true, and we're all so shocked that we missed the entire Russian Grand Prix. Not that we would have missed anything. But to give you a few examples, the shock Daniel Ricciardo move from Red Bull to Renault last year was peak silly season. Lewis Hamilton moving from McLaren to Mercedes in 2012, excellent silly season. And today, F1 friends, we will dip our first toe into the chaos that is silly season 2019, since over the past week or so, the first rumors have started flying around. So let's discuss. Let's, I think for practical purposes, start with the current frontrunners, Mercedes. So obviously Lewis Hamilton is still contracted there till 2020. And Bottas is now operating on his third consecutive one-year contract, which obviously expires at the end of the season. Now, I think we can safely say that Hamilton is not going anywhere till 2021, where the new regulations are slated to kick in. But whatever, there were some brief rumors that Hamilton is looking for a Ferrari drive, but you know what, I don't really see that happening anytime soon. So my prediction is Hamilton stays put exactly where he is, and he sort of confirmed that a few weeks ago where he said, listen, he still thinks he has at least 5 more good years left in F1, and given that he's currently, in the best seat at the best team, I don't really see him moving from Mercedes in the short term. Maybe if Ferrari steals a march on everybody in the 2021 regulations, we can maybe discuss Hamilton going there for a bit, but I think he's staying put at Mercedes. Now, Bottas is a much more interesting prospect since his contract on the most sought after seat currently in F1 expires at the end of the year. And as you can imagine, there are a couple of drivers already linked to that seat, most notably and most obvious Esteban Ocon. Probably the saddest reserve driver in history. I mean, you've all seen it. Ocon attends the race as the reserve driver. Every time basically that Bottas does something well, the TV producers cut to Esteban Ocon's face to see if you can see the actual despair and the light and hope dying out in his eyes. And then obviously if Bottas messes up in some way, again, the TV producers will cut to Esteban Ocon's face and just sort of see the joy glistening in his pupils. And I think probably this year might be his best chance, or actually next year might be his best chance of getting a drive, since, he is still backed by Toto Wolff, the current team principal of Mercedes. And I think they do feel slightly bad about Ocon being shafted out of Formula One for this year when Daniel Ricciardo moved to Renault and made the entire Formula One chessboard explode with, Ocon, who was the third prodigy in the tripartite alliance along with Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc. And he was the one left without a Formula One drive. And I think a lot of people last year were outraged, and I was also quite upset that a driver of Ocon's talent didn't actually get a seat this year. And it's all due to typical Formula One silly season politics and, teams conniving behind each other's backs to basically, either screw each other over or to put themselves in the best position to actually get the best drivers. But I think Ocon still has a very good chance of landing the Mercedes seat next year. So as I said, he was the third leg of that very, very talented group of juniors, along with Verstappen and Leclerc. And Ocon actually beat Max Verstappen in their Formula 3 season, if I'm not mistaken. So he is a very, very good driver, and all three of them have some colourful history where I think Verstappen and Ocon really dislike each other. And obviously we know Verstappen and Leclerc aren't big fans of each other as well. So I think it's going to be interesting, and I think I think if Bottas doesn't put in a very, very good performance over the remainder of the season, where he really matches Hamilton right up until the end, I think it's going to be the end of the road for him, since, you know, the second Mercedes seat is the most sought after seat in F1 at the moment. And another Mercedes junior driver that we can maybe talk about is George Russell. So he's currently driving at Williams. He was last year's Formula 2 champion, and he's just been putting in really, really good performances over at Williams, even though most of the time we don't notice, since they are so much slower than everybody else. But I feel he's probably just too young to step into the top seats with Hamilton. But, you know, it's silly season, so never say never. And although, actually, interestingly, there's been another complication recently where there's some rumors that have started, arising from the depths of the shady Formula 1 press, that Williams might be dropping Mercedes as engine suppliers at the end of the year and replacing them with Renault. So that could be an interesting span in the works for George Russell, given that he's sort of, on loan at Williams, given that Williams uses Mercedes engines and that Russell is a Mercedes junior. So it's going to be quite interesting to see what comes out of that, and whether these rumors are actually true. Now, thirdly, and I think this is an extremely long shot, but let's talk about it anyway, Max Verstappen. There were some rumors flying around that Max has a termination clause in his contract at Red Bull, and that if Red Bull doesn't perform up to standard, he can, trigger that clause, and then he's a free agent. But will Mercedes actually consider taking him on? Probably not. I think Hamilton is the king there, and I just don't see that Lewis will want Verstappen in his space and upset his carefully constructed apple cart, and just upset his whole aura that he's got going on there, since I think he's very happy with the current setup. Now, is there anyone else? I think almost everybody will probably be gunning for that seat, since it is Mercedes. So, maybe Nico Hülkenberg, if he doesn't get the Renault drive, although he's sort of a bit, he's a bit long in the tooth, unfortunately. And then, of course, we can't discount Valtteri Bottas staying at Mercedes, because he has been doing a solid job. But as I mentioned earlier, I think he really, really needs a stellar season this year to be able to keep that seat. Okay, so next up, we can talk about Ferrari, where things are quite interesting as well. So Sebastian Vettel is technically out of a contract at the end of next year, so at the end of 2020. But, over the past few months, there have been quite a few rumors that speculated about whether he could retire at the end of the year, and then he's sort of tired of how F1 is, and F1 isn't the way he wants it to be, and he sort of hoped that Ferrari would be the championship winning team this year, and it turned out to not really be the case. So all of this sort of added up into people saying that they think that Vettel might retire at the end of the year. I don't really think he is, just because, there's such a big regulation change coming at the end of next year, and so, then Ferrari might have a new opportunity to actually steal the march on all of the other teams. So I can't imagine Vettel not sticking around up until then, and then sort of deciding whether he sees himself in the team or not. There's actually been a specific rumor over the past week that really got silly season going, that said that Ferrari is potentially looking at either Daniel Ricciardo or Valtteri Bottas to replace Vettel if he retires at the end of the year. I'd be very surprised if Valtteri Bottas gets a Ferrari seat after not really making a massive impact at Mercedes. And, Daniel Ricciardo, maybe. But again, given, the massive fallout of him leaving Red Bull at the end of last year and then signing this multi-year deal with Renault, it's going to be really tricky for Ricciardo to end up at Ferrari, I think. And again, as I said, I don't really think Vettel is going to retire at the end of the year. Now the other driver, Charles Leclerc, he's sitting pretty till the end of 2022 when his contract expires. So I think he is secure for the time being. Obviously, except if he gets poached by a better team, which at the moment can only be Mercedes, and I see that as very unlikely as well, given Charles' affinity to Ferrari and the fact that he was part of the Ferraris junior driver program, and he sort of grew up with them. So I would be very surprised if he leaves the team within the next 2 or 3 years. So I don't think he's really going anywhere. Now, in terms of Red Bull, so Red Bull is also an interesting one. So, obviously, given that they're the top 3 teams, you would imagine that there's always going to be some rumors and politics flying around with regards to their seats. But with regards to Red Bull, we already spoke about Max Verstappen and his supposed termination clause, but I think that he has the same problem that Fernando Alonso had, a couple of years ago, where all the other teams or all the other big teams already have their main men. Mercedes has Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari has Vettel, and then if Vettel leaves, they have Charles Leclerc, and neither one of these two would really try and upset the very harmonious equilibrium currently existing within those teams. So personally, I don't think really that Verstappen has anywhere to go at the moment other than to stay at Red Bull, because I don't think Mercedes or Ferrari would at this stage take the risk of taking on Verstappen and then having another situation where they have, a Rosberg Hamilton situation at Mercedes or a Hamilton Fernando Alonso situation at McLaren in 2007. It just becomes messy and hard for the teams to manage. And I think with the current selection of drivers that they do have, they probably won't need to take on Max Verstappen, especially since both Ferrari and Red Bull have their own junior development programs with George Russell and Esteban Ocon for Mercedes sitting there. And then obviously, Ferrari have a few very good juniors in Formula 2 as well. Okay, but I guess you can never say never surrounding Max Verstappen, because he is a bit of a generational talent, I would say. So never know. Maybe one of those teams get greedy and decide that they want 2 stars in their team. So would be massively fascinating for us to see, but somehow I doubt it. Now let's move on to the sticky topic of Pierre Gasly. Now I don't think we need to beat around the bush. I have seen more successful communist governments in the 1980s than Gasly's start of the season. And rumors are swirling that Red Bull gave him more, 5 or so more races to sort himself out. Otherwise, it's au revoir to Mr. Pierre. But is he a talented driver? Yes, he is a talented driver. Do all talented drivers have long and successful F1 careers? No, unfortunately not. Just look at Stoffel van Doorn, who was the most successful junior driver from sort of Gasly's era in the junior leagues. And he just didn't make it in F1. He had the 2 seasons at McLaren, where McLaren was woeful. And unfortunately, he had nowhere to go. So he had to leave. Now, I guess the next question is, who could possibly replace Pierre Gasly? And the 2 most obvious candidates are Alex Albon and Daniel Kvyat, who are currently driving for the junior Red Bull team, Toro Rosso. And I guess, in terms of deciding between the 2, it's probably going to be dependent on the performance over the coming few races. But I think given that Red Bull Racing promoted Gasly a bit too early after only 1 year at Toro Rosso, and I think that did play a part in Gasly sort of struggling this year, I think they'd probably go with Daniel Kvyat before Alex Albon, just due to experience. Now, that would in itself be quite interesting because, if you followed Formula 1 a few years back, Daniel Kvyat was actually a driver at Red Bull alongside Daniel Ricciardo. And then in mid-2016, Kvyat was fired before the Spanish Grand Prix and replaced with Max Verstappen, where Kvyat then, finished off the year at Toro Rosso, and after that year was then promptly dropped from the team. And what a comeback for Daniel Kvyat to be back and then be back in the conversation for a Red Bull seat. So that could also be quite a redemptive story, which I guess would be quite nice. But Alex Albon, he's very, very talented junior driver. And I've mentioned previously on this podcast that Charles Leclerc actually rates Albon along with Max Verstappen as he's probably his most formidable opponent in the junior ranks. So I don't think Red Bull could go wrong with Alex Albon. I think just they might be a bit more wary due to his lack of experience in the top tier of the sport. Now, the last person that could potentially, make an impact here is, and there's also been a rumor that's been sort of arising over the past week or so, is Sebastian Vettel making his grand and spectacular return back to the team that basically made him into the driver that he is today. If I'm Vettel, I'd stay far away from being Max Verstappen's teammate. I just don't see that going very well for him. I think Max is operating at the peak of his powers, and to be frank, at the moment I only sort of see Lewis Hamilton being able to contend with him in the same machinery. Daniel Ricciardo sort of held on to his coattails last year, but I don't know, given Vettel's struggles against very strong teammates, I think it should be a hard pass for Sebastian Vettel. But, it could be interesting. I mean, who would not want to see Vettel versus Verstappen at Red Bull, to sort of see them fight for final, supremacy over the team. So, I mean, could be very fascinating and make for very interesting television. Okay, now let's move away from the top three teams and all of their politics and move on to the MVPs of the season thus far, which is McLaren. And, they have two star drivers that are probably going to remain there for quite a while. Both Carlos Sainz, Carlos Sainz actually used to be a Red Bull junior until they released him from his contract last year, and Lando Norris. They have both performed brilliantly well so far this year, so I don't really see a reason for any of them to move, except if a seat at Ferrari, Mercedes or Red Bull opens up. However, I think all of these teams, and as I've mentioned before, they have junior programs that feeds up into F1, so I think unlikely for any of those to really move up in the ranks. And to be honest, with McLaren's current trajectory, I don't think that they'll even have to move, because I think they're going to be back up in front before we know it. Now, Renault is another interesting one. Daniel Ricciardo, as I mentioned earlier, is on a massive multi-year contract, and he has expressed repeatedly that he would like to, sort of build the Renault team into being, title contenders again. But what is he going to do if a Ferrari drive opens up? Is he going to say no? I mean, it's going to be tough. I think we can never say never, but I think we can expect Danny Rick to still be in yellow next year. He created enough drama to last as a lifetime last year when he abruptly, left Christian Horner and Helmut Marko high and dry, and then he immediately became my favorite driver for the season, just for the absolute shock that when Red Bull realized that he actually decided that they are not going to bully him into staying, and that he realized that probably the team is too Max Verstappen centric and that he's never going to come to his own right there. And I think he made the absolute right choice to come to Renault. But now Renault needs to do its part and actually give him a race-winning car again. So let's see how that turns out. Now, the other Renault driver is Nico Hülkenberg, and he is a bit more of a palaver. Now, his contract is up at the end of the year, and Renault already admitted to looking at their options, so looking at potential other drivers. Now, I think it has to be said that Nico Hülkenberg is extremely talented and he is underrated, but even I have to admit that he hasn't yet performed up to scratch this year. Over the past few years, he has been, I think, along with Sergio Perez, he's been the class of sort of the Formula 1.5, field, and he still is a very, very capable driver, and I think he won the B League, if you can call it that, championship last year, where, other than the top 6 drivers, he was the next best driver in terms of performances. So, I mean, I think, and if he performs to a similar level this year, and I really sort of starts to build up some momentum, I think it's going to be really difficult for Renault to not give him a drive next year, given his capabilities. But let's maybe think about what other options Renault might have. So I just spoke about him. They might look at Sergio Perez, another very experienced and capable midfield driver who's currently at Racing Point. However, I don't really think Sergio Perez would jump ship like that. Another potential option could be Esteban Ocon, and sort of Toto Wolff alluded to that a bit, where they are currently thinking of arranging a drive for him at Renault. But again, it's going to be tough for Ocon to get in there, especially given the other options that they have available. Speaking of, so there's actually a Renault junior called Jack Aitken who's doing quite well in Formula 2, and he's 5th in the championship there at the moment. So, I mean, they might decide to go for the fountain of youth and get Jack Aitken in for his first season next year. And even Mercedes junior George Russell might, be given a shot, given how talented he is. So, I mean, there are a few very good options, and I think the Renault seat might be, a bit of one of those sort of linchpins that can decide where a lot of other drivers go in terms of other teams. So let's see how that all pans out. The next team I want to talk about is Alfa Romeo. So in terms of Alfa Romeo, Kimi Räikkönen is still contracted till next year, and he's just sort of doing a very spectacular victory lap, for his last 2 years in Formula 1. I think next year is going to be his last year, and then he will leave in a blaze of glory and success. The other driver is Antonio Giovinazzi. So he's also, I would say, a driver at risk. He's on a 1-year contract, and he does need to perform very well for Sauber and also for Ferrari to keep him on, given that Alfa Romeo, and given that Alfa Romeo is a sort of junior team for Ferrari. I think especially since Ferrari does have a few very good juniors sort of up and coming, participating in Formula 2 this year, most notably obviously Mick Schumacher, the much lauded son of Michael Schumacher, and he is, I guess, in a way destined to sit in a Ferrari one day, so they might decide to give him his shot. And then also another junior is Callum Ilott, who is currently driving for the sort of junior Alfa Romeo team in Formula 2. And also Giuliano Alesi, who is the son of John Alesi, who is also a Ferrari driver. So quite a stacked field in terms of juniors coming up and threatening Giovinazzi's seat. And there's even another Italian called Luca Giotto. So if they want to go that route and a more nationalistic route, there's even another option there. And I think he's also doing quite well in Formula 2, if I'm not mistaken. So it's going to be tough for Giovinazzi. I think he's going to really have to start outperforming Räikkönen consistently, because I think even matching Kimi isn't going to be enough to really guarantee him a seat for next year. And then the other junior Ferrari team is Haas. Their current drivers there is Kevin Magnussen and Roman Grosjean. And I think this is probably the team that could move the most, with Roman Grosjean really at risk of losing his seat by the end of the year. He hasn't performed well. I mean, the car, I'll admit, the car is a bit of a mess so far. But, Kevin Magnussen did perform well when he had the opportunity to. I think the only shot for Roman Grosjean will be if he can do what he did last year in the second half of the season and just be lights out every race. But I think this was sort of his second chance, and I don't really think Grosjean has really taken it up yet. And given that it is another junior Ferrari team, as I mentioned with Alfa Romeo, there are so many good and promising young drivers coming up that Ferrari might push for one of those to actually fill one or maybe even two seats at Haas. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. But I think Kevin Magnussen, if he continues in the way that he's been going, he'll probably get another year. I'm actually not sure that he still has a contract for next year. I need to go check that out. But Kevin Magnussen, probably the odds-on favorite between the two of them to stay on at Haas. So let's see. Now, Team Racing Point, it's pretty simple. Papa Stroll has bought Little Lance his seat, so that's where he'll stay for the foreseeable future. So I'm not going to really say anything there. The other driver is Sergio Perez. As I've mentioned previously, probably along with Hülkenberg, he's been the most successful midfield driver over the past few years. So I won't be surprised if he stays. But if he leaves, and I don't really know where he'll go, but in any case, if he leaves, I think we can look for Esteban Ocon to come back and make Racing Point his team. But as I said, I really think old Sergio will stay. Now let's talk about one of the really interesting teams, I think, for next year. And this is Toro Rosso, Red Bull's junior team. And the reason I think it's going to be interesting is because Red Bull is in a weird position at the moment where they're in a bit of a drought when it comes to having sort of junior drivers in the pipeline. Where if you think a few years back, they had, Carlos Sainz and Pierre Gasly and Daniel Kvyat and Alex Albon, and they had so many talented guys sort of bubbling under and waiting to get their big break into Formula One. Where now, they have two not very, clear-cut ones at that. So they have Patricio O'Ward from Mexico and Yuri Vips, who is currently in Formula 3. And they technically, both of them don't have enough points on their racing licenses to be in Formula 1. So for them to actually, get into F1 regardless, they're going to actually really have to perform well in the current sort of championships that they're participating in to get enough, they call it super license points to make the minimum requirement for F1. And I guess that's also under the assumption that one of the current Toro Rosso drivers, gets promoted for next year. And that Gasly is fired good and proper, so that they literally completely fire Gasly out of the whole Red Bull program. Now, I guess Gasly could also move down and continue at Toro Rosso, partnering, either Albon or Kvyat if one of them moves up into the big team. Or, even Red Bull Racing could decide to keep Pierre Gasly if he does turn his season around. So I really don't know what's going to happen here. It's even possible that things shake up a bit and Red Bull, they don't have actually any eligible juniors to move up into Toro Rosso. And that could be, an opportunity for someone like the current F2 championship leader, Nick de Vries, or, any other current F1 driver that loses his seats in an interesting way. So, no idea what's going to happen at Toro Rosso. And at last, we can talk about our slow coaches of 2019, which is poor old Williams. I think George Russell, who is a Mercedes junior, he has been very impressive there so far, even though we weren't really allowed to notice yet. So if he doesn't move up into another team, I think he'll definitely stay. Robert Kubica, I'm afraid, probably isn't going to stay. He brought money to the team, but there's another junior called Nicholas Latifi, who's racing in Formula 2, and he's tested a few times already this year for Williams, and he's also bringing big sponsors and big bucks. So I expect Kubica to be out and Latifi to be in. But let's see, maybe we get thrown a complete curveball. If Williams start using Renault engines as rumored, then they might actually, promote the Renault Junior Jack Aitken. He might have a chance. So it's going to be interesting to see. I think then before we sort of wrap up today's discussion on silly season, I think let's maybe also talk about just the junior formulae and especially Formula 2, where it's usually a good indication of sort of the up and coming drivers and which, new drivers we could potentially expect in Formula 1. So the current leader there is Nick de Vries, who was part of the McLaren team up until earlier this year, where he was sort of their simulator driver. So he did some simulator work for them, but he left the team earlier this year, which then I think means he's not currently affiliated to any of the junior sort of programs, which I think puts him at a bit of a disadvantage, given that, Mercedes, Ferrari, Red Bull, and now Renault and McLaren have junior driver programs, which all are quite stacked, except for, I think, Red Bulls. So it's going to be difficult for someone like Nick de Vries to break into F1 without the backing of one of those big teams, which is why I mentioned when I was talking about Toro Rosso that, the sort of mess going on there might lead to an opportunity for de Vries if neither, Award or Vips actually get enough super license points to be in for a driver at Toro Rosso next year. Now, the current second placer in Formula 2 his name is Sergio Sette Camara, and he's currently a McLaren junior, but unfortunately I don't see him getting a seat anywhere, just because McLaren, they currently have two very young drivers driving for them, and neither one of those two are foreseen to really leave anytime soon. So, Williams could be his best shot, or I guess Toro Rosso as well, with the same argument that I made for Nick de Vries. And then the last one that's quite interesting is Nikita Mazepin, who was recently signed to the Mercedes Young Drivers program, and he's Russian and he's rich, but he'll probably just do another term in F2, given that this is, I think, his debut season, and that Mercedes is definitely not going to open up anytime soon, with both Esteban Ocon and George Russell still in the queue for a seat there. So there we are. Hopefully this gave you a good overview of all the politicking currently happening between all the teams and all the drivers. And I think the one lesson we can take from this is that F1 is a pretty cutthroat sport. One day you're in and the next day you're out. I think the two happiest drivers are probably Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc, since they know they're definitely staying where they are and at a top team as well for the next couple of years. But as always, with silly season, you never know what's going to happen. Maybe Lawrence Stroll will buy Ferrari next, and then he'll kick out Vettel and send him to Racing Point. Or Danny Rick maybe breaks the chessboard again and goes to Mercedes with Lewis Hamilton. You never know, but at least we'll have dubious journalists reporting on any ridiculous rumor that they can get their hands on. So what do you think? Do you have any dream driver pairings? Please leave a comment if you think of one, and we can discuss how it's possibly going to happen. You can also engage with me on Twitter, where my handle is @TF1 Show, or on Instagram, where my handle is @TheTF1 Show. If you enjoyed this episode, or if you believe that maybe one day you will enjoy an episode, please hit the subscribe button and leave a rating. It's been, as always, an absolute joy to talk to you guys, and I'll see you next week for the British Grand Prix. Cheers!